All right, on this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about mushroom cloning and how mushrooms reproduce. So I've studied this for a bit, and even though I understood it, a long time ago I read that if you don't know how to explain things in simple terms, it means that you don't really understand it. So I was thinking about explaining this because some people have asked me about it, and I wanted to make sure I understood this stuff really well before I start talking about this. So I went into a real deep dive of the mushroom, the mycelium reproduction system. Now, first thing is that mushrooms produce sexually and asexually. Here's our beautiful mushroom. And of course, spores. The wind can take the spores all over the place. It is believed that spores can go from one side of the world all the way to the other. And of course, another real cool thing is that spores can survive in space, in the vacuum of space. So Panspermia could have happened with spores, all that neat stuff. But here's the funny thing. Not all spores are created equal. Some spores can reproduce sexually, and others asexually. Now, if we think about mammals, all mammals reproduce sexually, right? You got the ovum and the sperm, and the sperm gets in the ovum. I mean, there's millions of them trying to get in, and only one or two gets in. And then this starts splitting, and then it keeps multiplying and getting more and more complex until you have a little guy in there that looks like a lizard. A real big eye, looks like an alien, which, by the way, is male and female at the beginning, hermaphrodite, and then the sexual organs divide into one or two, or if you are slated to live a real weird life, you'll end up with both, because it never equalizes into one sex, which are hermaphrodites, which have both male and female organs at the same time, which is another interesting thing that we don't have to get into. But this is how mammals do it. Now, although mushrooms and fungi are more related to humans or mammals than to plants, which makes it interesting. They eat, they breathe, they reproduce sexually and asexually, as we will see. They are more similar to animals and mammals than they are to plants. So, the spores that produce asexually, these are haploid. Haploid spores. Think of haploid as half, because they have half the genetics. And the ones that reproduce sexually are diploid or diploid. And those contain a full set of genetics or genes. So the haploid spores can only reproduce asexually. And when they reproduce asexually, it's called vegetative propagation, like plants, like vegetables. And when they reproduce sexually, the process is called karyogamy. So this is called karyogamy, which is a fusion of two haploid nuclei. So when it's sexual, they have to have two haploid spores that fuse into one. Pretty much like these do, like mammals do. Now, because karyogamy is the same thing as what happens when a sperm fertilizes the egg. It's called karyogamy as well. Okay, the cool thing about fungi is that some of them can switch between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction depending on the circumstances. For example, some may reproduce asexually when conditions are stable, but then switch to sexual reproduction when there are challenges in the environment or when they need to adapt to their environment. So, sexual reproduction, wish my handwriting was better. So sexual reproduction is used when the conditions are stable. And asexual reproduction when conditions are not stable. And this makes sense because if there's bad conditions, it's a lot harder to reproduce sexually because if the conditions are not good, that extra step of fusing two different genetics and starting that whole process can be slowed down or impaired by the environment. And some of those environmental issues are temperature. Think about it. In cooler temperatures, when temperature goes down, drops, they reproduce asexually because cold inhibits mycelial growth. If you think about it, we put our liquid culture in the fridge or our agar cups in the fridge to slow it down and make it dormant so it lasts longer, the mycelium. So when things get colder, the mushroom or the mycelium will try to reproduce asexually. When it's warmer, temperature goes up, they reproduce sexually. And like we said, colder temperatures can make it difficult for two different spores to find a compatible mate. That's what happens if it gets colder. If it's warmer, it's easier, so they tend to switch to sexual reproduction. Now, if we're going to clone, and we take a mushroom and we split it in half, and then we split it so we can get a clean tissue culture, and we take some tissue from here, and then we put that into our petri dish, put it in there, and then it grows, which to me has always been so amazing, because you take a piece of tissue, put it in agar, it starts eating the agar, and it turns into mycelium. It's like it just multiplies like magic. So this is how we clone, but we tend not to think about that, because okay, you take a piece of the mushroom, you put it in agar, it starts growing, but what genetics are you getting? Well, that's why we call it a clone, because you're isolating the genetics, or what they also call a monoculture, because it's mono, it's one, it's a culture from only one mushroom. So when you do that, you're essentially creating a genetic identical copy of the original mushroom. So these genetics are going to give you, if this one, you got it, like I always say, get it from mushrooms that are in a really good cluster, you get it from this cluster, you're getting the exact same genetics. So what that means is that these will tend to grow in those real thick clusters. If you get it from a deformed mushroom, you're going to get the same genetics, or you're going to get a deformed mushroom. It doesn't affect that much the size. A lot of people go like, oh, that's a big one, clone it, because size has to do with other things. It's the first flush gives you way smaller mushrooms, second flush gives you bigger mushrooms, third flush gives you bigger mushrooms. And if you've been cloning, it's going to be the same genetics. It's just the flush. You don't always get big mushrooms from cloned tissue from a big mushroom, because there are other factors, and also other factors are also the environment. Okay, but you will get, if you clone the tissue in agar and then put that into grain, and then put that in your bag or in your tub, you're gonna get pretty much the same mushrooms that you got from your tissue, because it's a clone. Now, what that gives you is more predictable results of your grows. It does have some limitations, because you may lack genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is nature's way of ensuring that this mushroom or this mycelium is going to be able to adapt to different environments. And here's an interesting story about adapting. If I haven't read scientific papers on this, but from experience, it seems like, so don't kill me on this, because this is experience. This is what it seems like, and talking with other growers, this is what we believe. So take it with a grain of salt, try it, and see if you see the same thing. The way it happened to us was, I got a agar from a clone that historically was grown on oats, whole oats. And then when I put it to grow on rice and on popcorn, it didn't grow well, it contaminated, it just did not thrive. When it did grow, it grew, it was hard for it to grow in rice and popcorn. And at first my friend was like, well, that's why I always use oats, because oats are better. But then we started talking and we started analyzing the stuff. And what we believe happens, mycelium from a cloned mushroom that had been historically grown on oats. So it expected oats. So then when I switched it to oats, it started growing great. The conclusion that we came up with is that it's because I took a clone that is used to growing in oats. But the next step is to take spores from whatever's grown on oats, from a fruit that's grown on oats, and take those spores and grow them in agar. And then, since they're going to reproduce sexually and they're going to have a lot more variety of genes, more genetic diversity, it'll be easier for it to grow in rice or popcorn or anything else. So that's what we mean by when you clone, you lack genetic diversity and adaptability, because adaptability comes from sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction does not give you adaptability because you only have half of the genetics. You only have genetics specific to one side. It's not sexual. You're not mixing genetics from two different spores. Just one spore can grow, and it has only its genetics. It's not combining, which is why, if you think about it, a lot of dogs that are purebred, they're inbred a lot. So they lose their genetic diversity. So they start getting genetic related problems like ear infections, eye infections, even like hip dysplasia, like happens to German Shepherds. Okay, so when you do monoculture and you're cloning, another thing that happens is the mushrooms that are produced will most likely only have asexual spores, since they were produced through asexual reproduction. They never mated with another type of mycelium or other spores. So they tend to only have asexual spores from monoculture or clones. So from clones, you usually get asexual spores, which again makes it harder for it to adapt. It adapts way better when the mushroom was created with sexual reproduction. Because think about it. Let's say you take an agar plate and you put a bunch of spores in there. If they are sexual spores, not asexual, they meet and they reproduce. So you can have different, they can reproduce in different places. Like you can, that's why you get from, we always say it's a crapshoot, because when you put it in agar and you put a bunch of it, you get different types of mycelium. You may get like real stringy rhizomorphic mycelium here, and then here you get the Tomentose fluffy, and then you get more fluffy here and then more rhizomorphic here, because this is sexual reproduction and you're getting different genetics mixing together. Even when you grow monoculture mushrooms, a cloned mushroom can still have sexual and asexual spores, like we said before. So it'll still, it's like, it's so smart. Nature's way, or the mycelium's way of ensuring that it can still reproduce in weird or difficult environments. So even when you clone, the spores you will usually get sexual and asexual spores, which is a good thing, because that's why you should always refresh your genetics. Even after you've been saving them for a while, you should refresh them. And you know what, go from spores every now and then and start another grow from that, and then start cloning the best ones from there, because you're kind of refreshing your genetics, even though the mushrooms came from the same line. And these are actually produced from structures in here in the gills called basidia. In case I'm pronouncing it wrong, Basidia, basidia. So that's why this basidia can generate sexual and asexual spores no matter what. So even though we call it a monoculture and we call it a clone, you can still get some degree of variation in the type of spores produced, although you are cloning and they came from an identical mushroom. And remember, the mushroom is the fruit. The mycelium, it gets compared with the roots of plants, but that's kind of misleading because it's not roots. This is the actual fungi. The mycelium is the fungi. The mushroom is the fruit. That's why when you see mold, it never fruits. Mold reproduces kind of in the same way, but without a mushroom, without fruiting. Like the green mold that you get on bread and stuff, it's never gonna grow mushrooms because it's just a different type of fungi. But so they say, oh, the mycelium is the roots of the fungi. Not really. It is the fungi. This is the structure. This is the not the plant, because they're more related to animals than plants. This is the fungi. And then the fruit goes up through the substrate or the earth. It's an amazing way to do it, because it's the actual fungi, the actual being, the actual living thing is under the ground all the time. So it's a lot harder. Well, on most species, on many species, it's a lot harder for it to die because it's protected. But then the fungi, which is the actual fruit, which is why we call it the fruiting body, is what has the spores, which would be kind of like the seeds. So remember that the same fungi can reproduce sexually or asexually. And if you go back and listen to all this stuff once or twice more, you'll start understanding how this goes and why we keep saying, conserve your genetics, conserve your genetics, conserve your genetics. Again, cloning is the way to go, if you ask me. I think that's it. I can't think of anything else to say on this topic, but and I hope I explained it easy enough, even though we have a few weird terms like diploid and haploid and karyogamy and all that crap. But just go back, listen to this video a couple times, watch it, and listen to the information a couple times, and it'll help you. You'll have some spores in your brain that are gonna germinate and grow and help you at the right time. And also think about the difference between colder temperatures and warmer temperatures and all that stuff. So yeah, hope this helped. And also, don't take my word for it. Study up on it. Read books. Books are great. Books from people that know what they're talking about. Not only just videos, because what if I got everything wrong and this is all bullshit? I didn't, but you know what I mean. Read books, study up, get into it. All right. Hope this helps.